Addressing Gettysburg.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all. My name is Christopher Gwynn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at Gettysburg National Military Park. And as always, welcome back to the Winter Lecture Series. We are so grateful that you're here, in part because we have a very special guest that I'm about to introduce today. But before that, a couple of reminders. First off, as always, please silence your cell phones. Secondly, we are very grateful to the work of Matt Calorie and Addressing Gettysburg, who have been filming each of the winter lectures. So if you can't be here in person or you want to rewatch something, please go to Addressing Gettysburg's YouTube page. They have a listing of all the lectures that have occurred thus far. The sound quality is exceptional, the visual quality is fantastic, and we are very grateful to Matt and Addressing Gettysburg for doing that for us. We are honored to have with us here today Wayne Motts, President Emeritus and Historian of the Gettysburg Foundation. And Wayne likely requires no introduction amongst this audience, but indulge me. He is a prolific author and writer. Among his titles, of course, is Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, a guide to the most famous attack in American history, which he co-authored with James Hessler. It is available at fine bookstores everywhere, but most especially here in the bookstore, the Museum and Visitor Center. Wayne is a dedicated researcher, a passionate speaker on subjects related to the Battle of Gettysburg, the American Civil War, and American history. He has made the preservation, protection, and appreciation of Gettysburg and its story his life's work. And this work has taken him on a journey that has extended from the ranks of the Licensed Battlefield Guides, where he serves, as the director of the Adams County Historical Society, president of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, and the helm of the Gettysburg Foundation, of course, the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service. For the last 3 years, those of us in the Park Service wearing the green and gray have been able to work alongside Wayne here at the Museum and Visitor Center. We look forward to working with him more in the future. He has played a critical role in helping us advance our mission, and he's not only a colleague now, I consider him a good friend. So please join me in welcoming to the Winter Lecture Series, Mr. Wayne Motts.
Wow. Chris, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Wow, what an introduction. He better have something good to say, huh? Chris, thank you so much. I'm very honored to be with you. I'll try to turn this down because I tend to speak kind of loud. Matt's going to get me wandering around everywhere. I'll move that down a little. Everybody can hear me, right? You shouldn't have, give us, I remember when I first started battlefield guiding here 36 years ago, people would say, give us the skinniest guide and give us the loudest guide. And I got it on both counts here. I'm honored to be with you this afternoon, part of the Winter Lecture Series. I want to thank Chris. I want to thank all my friends and colleagues that are out in this room and all of you for coming to attend. So let's hope that I can give a great talk. We're off to a good start. One of my friends, who here is a native of Michigan? If you're a native of Michigan, raise your hand. All right, I'll tell it to you slow so you understand it. As a native Buckeye, there's some sort of irony in a native Buckeye given this, isn't there? But I had my friend down here in the front row said, do you know what the Latin means in the state seal? And yes, I do. So out of many one, which is up here at the top, to bore, and I'm sure my Latin's going to be terrible, I will defend. And then the bottom part down here is look around and you'll see, and I'm paraphrasing it, a nice peninsula. That's basically what it says. Now, John will tell me, no, it's not quite that, but that's basically what it is. And the elk and the moose, of course, if you're up in the state of Michigan. So I always, when I do these programs, I always want to know what am I going to talk about as far as the stories. If you're here today and you want to hear about the movements of Michigan units in the Battle of Gettysburg, you're in the wrong place, folks, because we're going to tell stories here today. We're going to pick out 5 Michigan soldiers, and we're going to talk about them and their roles here in the battle. But I always want to know, what stories am I going to tell, and who am I going to dedicate the program to? So despite the fact that I'm a native Buckeye, my aunt and uncle lived in Michigan for more than 4 decades, and I'm going to dedicate this program to them today. They're over here, my Uncle Fred and my Aunt Nancy. They lived in Milan, Michigan, which is only about 20 miles or so from Monroe, the spot where George Armstrong Custer, of course, attended and lived. We lost my uncle at age 60 to the same brain tumor that claimed the lives of Edward Kennedy and John McCain. And we lost my aunt several years ago in 2019 to acute myeloid leukemia. They're both gone now, but my uncle would always say, if you want to come to a real school, come up here to Ann Arbor, and you can go to the University of Michigan. So to my aunt and uncle, I'm going to dedicate this program, residents of Milan, Michigan, for nearly 40 years. And my niece just started her first year in college, to tell you how old this image actually is. So, Aunt and Uncle, here you go. We're going to try to do the best to honor you today in your memory. Let's talk a little bit about Michigan and the Civil War, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, the population of Michigan is relatively small at the time of the Civil War. If you lived in New York City, the population of New York City, not counting Brooklyn, which was separate back in those days, was 800,000 people. That's more than everybody that lives in the state of Michigan in the 1860 census. And Michigan had about 45,000 people in its largest city, which was number 19 on the city list for the United States in 1860. Detroit was the 19th largest city at the outbreak of the American Civil War. And Grand Rapids, the second largest city. Notice the difference between the largest city in Michigan and the second largest city. Grand Rapids had a population of 8,085. And I looked it up. The population of York, Pennsylvania in 1860 was 8,603 people. More people lived in York, Pennsylvania than lived in Grand Rapids at the outbreak of the American Civil War. Now, despite this, Michigan fields a lot of soldiers in the Civil War when it comes to the number of people they had. They had about 126,000 males of military age, and they fielded more than 90,000 men in the Civil War. Think about that percentage. And that's Michigan troops that are in Michigan units. Now, we also know, thanks to my friend here, Tom Dank, Tom is in the audience, that he gave me some research materials on Michigan soldiers that fought at Gettysburg that aren't in Michigan units. There's several of them in the U.S. Regular Army units and from a couple other volunteer regiments that are here. But Michigan puts a lot of soldiers. You've got 126,000, and that doesn't count anybody that had any type of mental or physical disability, and you're fielding over 90,000 soldiers in the war. That is a significant number. 4,000 probably in non-Michigan regiments. They had 31 total Michigan infantry units, including one USCT regiment, 11 cavalry regiments, 14 artillery brigades. You can see all the numbers that are down here, and at least 14,000 of them died in the war. There are 583 Union generals in the Civil War, and 4 of them are born in the state of Michigan. Now, we had 4 here affiliated from Michigan, and 2 were born in the state of Michigan. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we go forward. And you probably didn't know that the 4th Michigan Cavalry is the unit. Those soldiers in the 4th Michigan Cavalry are the ones that captured Jefferson Davis when he is fleeing down in Irwinville, Georgia on the 10th of May, 1865. So Michigan, despite its small size, fields a large percentage number of its military-age males in the Civil War, and they're in every major action, east and west, that you can think of at the time of the American Civil War. Now let's talk a little bit about Michigan. Did Michigan really have 3,894 men at Gettysburg? Well, if you're hung up on numbers, this is Busey and Martin's Regimental Strengths and Losses, the numbers that, the go-to book that we always go to for numbers. So we had just under 4,000 Michigan troops here. They're engaged in all 3 days of the battle. And about 200 were killed here. And the National Cemetery has 171 bodies on the Michigan plot sign. They actually don't have that many bodies in the cemetery. And the 4 general officers affiliated with Gettysburg, Alpheus Williams and George Custer. Now, I'm in Ohio, and I'm not going to let Michigan have Custer permanently, guys, because Custer was born in the state of Ohio, although he moves to Michigan, where his sister is in Monroe. And Alpheus Williams is born in Connecticut, but Williams would be the highest ranking officer at Gettysburg affiliated with Michigan. He's got a beautiful statue in Detroit, Michigan, and he is buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit, Michigan. And Alon Farnsworth, of course, born in Michigan, and is buried out in Illinois. But these are the 4 affiliated general officers we had from the state of Michigan. And you can see the infantry regiments, cavalry units, 1 unit of artillery, an independent group of sharpshooters, and 3 companies in the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters and a 4th company in the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters. And what you may not know is that Hiram Berdan, the organizer of the Berdan Sharpshooters, 1st and 2nd United States Sharpshooters, although he was born in the state of New York, where was he living at the outbreak of the war? Plymouth, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. And his parents are buried there today. Berdan himself is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. But this is a rundown of Michigan here in the Battle of Gettysburg, and we're going to pick out some stories and tell you a little bit about some Michigan soldiers here in the Battle of Gettysburg. And let's start with William Schuler Woodruff of the 1st Michigan Infantry Regiment from Marshall, Calhoun County, Virginia. Let's talk a little bit about him. This beautiful image is from friend and Michigan collector John Fuller. Wonderful image of him as a 1st lieutenant. So, what do we know about Woodruff? Well, first of all, he's one of 8 children. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan, and despite that, I put him in my talk today. In 1860, he's actually a teacher in Marshall. This is in central Michigan, is where this man was from. He's wounded and captured at Bull Run, and he's wounded here on July 2nd, 1863, fighting with the 1st Michigan Infantry Regiment on the outskirts of the wheat field on July 2nd, 1863. He would have been a sergeant, and then he's promoted to 2nd lieutenant and then over to 1st lieutenant, and he dies in 1864. This image is probably him. We know from his service record he's promoted to 1st lieutenant May in 1864. So this would be an 1864 image of him right after his promotion is my guess on it. Here's the monument to the 1st Michigan Infantry. If you know anything about this unit, it fights on Stony Hill. It had about 142 men engaged in the battle and some 42 casualties. It's in the 1st Brigade, 1st Division of the 5th Corps, and it fights in and around the wheat field in several areas against Kershaw's brigade. So it'd be against the right flank of Kershaw at around 5 o'clock on July 2nd, 1863. Now Woodruff, who had been previously wounded in 1862 and captured, back with his unit, an officer in this unit in the Battle of Gettysburg, and he's wounded in the cheek on July 2nd, 1863. And this is an interesting letter that's found in his service record. This actually shows that he's back up in Marshall, Michigan on the 15th of July. And I want you to remember this because he's going to come into our story a little bit later on. We're going to reconnect him with another one of these stories. He gets a leave on the 5th of July. He gets up to Marshall, Michigan on the 15th of July. He writes this letter to the Adjutant General, and he basically tells the Adjutant General that he's been recently wounded at Gettysburg, and he is present at his home, signing as a 2nd lieutenant, which is his rank in the Battle of Gettysburg. Unfortunately, he'll recover. He'll go back out to the front, and he will be wounded in the side at the Battle of Petersburg. He'll be wounded on the 25th of June. He'll die on the 28th of the month, and he'll be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. This is actually talks a little bit about him, and this is out of the Marshall Statesman, which is the local newspaper that was there at the time. And then here is his burial site at in Arlington National Cemetery, buried up near where Robert E. Lee's home is. Not in the garden, not in Mrs. Lee's garden, but fairly close to it. So unfortunately, he will not rest in the same cemetery that some of his family rest in up in Marshall and Calhoun, Michigan. Now, if you're out on the 2nd day's battle, he's fighting in the 2nd day's battle. We've got units I'm going to show you to fight on the second and the third day's battle, so let's talk a little bit about July 3rd, 1863. Now, I've been in this business an awful lot of years, but I said, you know, I'd really like to find, do you think I could find a Michigan Confederate soldier in the Battle of Gettysburg? And there's a sure way to get that, and that's to ask your friend and mentor. So every battlefield guide, I guess, has a friend and mentor, somebody that's helped them their guiding career. Mine is Edward Guy Jr., who's been a battlefield guide here almost 40 years. And when I first joined the guide force, Ed helped me pass the oral examination. I took him out the night before my oral exam, and I wouldn't be a battlefield guide today if it hadn't been for his thoughtfulness and his assistance in helping me. And boy, there's hardly a story at Gettysburg that Ed doesn't know. So I said, look, I'm talking Michigan to Gettysburg. Do you think you could find me a Michigan soldier fighting at Gettysburg who was in the Confederate Army? And sure enough, he does. So let's talk about Henry Cummings, who's in the Sumter Artillery. And that is a unit that is in the third day's battle over by the North Carolina Monument, fighting in the cannonade and also in the assault for Pickett's charge, of course, in the firing for that. And it all stems from this story that's in the Confederate Veteran Magazine. Now, Confederate Veteran Magazine is published in 1893. It's in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a bi-monthly magazine, and it's in print all the way up to 1932. And boy, there's a lot of great stories in Confederate Veteran Magazine. This one, written by Thomas L. Norman from West Point, Georgia, in the 1915 issue, says that there was a bright young man he thought he was 23 years old and a native of Michigan from Detroit that was in the Sumter Light Artillery. Now, this soldier had been in a Louisiana unit, and it says up here that he was in New Orleans reading law in a law office of a relative there. That Louisiana unit was part of the famed Louisiana Tigers that ends up fighting here in the Battle of Gettysburg. And Henry Cummings is transferred into a Georgia artillery unit coming from Louisiana. This man living in Michigan, born in Michigan, and then moving to New Orleans a couple years before the war. Sounds like Wesley Culp, right? We're going to have friends, we're going to have people we know, and he ends up joining the Confederate Army and fighting here in the Battle of Gettysburg as a member of the Sumter Light Artillery. So, can we find out, is this guy in New Orleans, or is he not in New Orleans? And sure enough, he is in New Orleans. He is the only Henry Cummings in the 1860 census born in the state of Michigan. It says right there he is, and it says that he is a clerk. Well, he's a clerk. I tried to find out, well, what relative maybe can we link him up with. I didn't find any relatives by this last name, so maybe it's his mother's relative or a different relative, so I couldn't find out where he's reading law, but he's a little older in the census record here, but this is him. He's the only Henry Cummings in the New Orleans census for 1860, and this clearly is him, and he's at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And this is the location of where he is on July 3rd, 1863. Battery C, Winfield's battery, Captain Winfield was wounded here in the Battle of Gettysburg. And according to the Confederate veteran, when Pettigrew's troops go forward and Trimble's men go forward, Henry Cummings jumps up on this stone wall and is waving his hat. And he's slightly wounded here in the Battle of Gettysburg. Unfortunately, he is killed by a mortar at the Battle of Petersburg, the same battle that Woodruff dies in, struck by a mortar and killed there in July of 1863. That's there. But this is a Confederate soldier in the Battle of Gettysburg, across from the Union line in Pickett's charge, born in Detroit, Michigan, and fighting here as a Confederate soldier. And what's interesting about that Confederate veteran article is it says that there wasn't a better soldier in the Confederate Army for Robert E. Lee than Henry Cummings, our native from the state of Michigan. Now, he's about 1,400 yards away, ladies and gentlemen, from Ziegler's Grove. He is firing artillery on the Union line along the Cemetery Ridge and along the Ziegler's Grove area. So let's link that back on the other side for July 3rd with a Union artillerist from the state of Michigan, George Augustus Woodruff. Woodruff's got a great history as he is a first lieutenant in command of Battery I of the 1st United States Artillery Regiment stationed with Napoleon's in Ziegler's Grove on July 3rd, 1863. Now, let's connect where he is. So first of all, Henry Cummings is right over here where F is, firing on A, which is where George Woodruff is. And you'll see the Virginia Memorial is at E, Pennsylvania at B. This will be the field hospital where he will be taken. We'll talk a little bit about that for the Grand Schoolhouse, and then D over here at the Spangler Farm. Now, what do we know about Woodruff? Well, guess what? Woodruff was born in 1840, and guess who his brother is? We just connected his brother out with the 1st Michigan. There's 2 brothers fighting at Gettysburg, both of them wounded here in the Battle of Gettysburg, both of them from Marshall, Calhoun County, Michigan, right in central Michigan, one of them dying here, and that's this man, George Augustus Woodruff. This battery, a regular Army battery, Woodruff is a graduate in the June class of 1861. He's in great company there, right? We know who's first in that class at Gettysburg, Patrick O'Rourke. We know who's last in that class, Custer, a Michigan guy, well, somewhat Michigan, right? We talked a little bit about that. And this battery, the 2nd lieutenant of this battery, Tully McCray, talks a lot about it. McCray survives the Battle of Gettysburg. He's an 1862 graduate of the United States Military Academy, and we'll talk a little bit about where he is. This is the location of that battery for July 3rd, 1863. These are the Napoleons today. It would have been against the left end of what we call Pickett's Charge. I'm sure Pettigrew and Trimble's men wouldn't like that because this is where they're fighting on July 3rd. But these are units going up against the Confederate left of the attack for July 3rd, 1863. And here's Tully McCray. What a great image. West Point had photo albums beginning in 1857. So if you're a West Point graduate beginning in 1857, you can find photos of a lot of these cadets. The cadets would take the photos and put them and assemble their own albums to put these images together. And this is a cadet. Notice it says Urbana, Ohio. McCray was from Ohio, but he was actually born in the state of Mississippi. And he is an 1862 graduate, as I mentioned. He comes into this battery and fights with it on July 2nd and 3rd. He writes reminiscences in 1904. This man enters West Point in 1858, basically, graduates from West Point in 1862, and then he'll spend 45 years, counting his cadet years, in the United States military. He retires a brigadier general, and he's a 2nd lieutenant in the Battle of Gettysburg. In his reminiscences, he writes, "The officers and men were very fond and proud of this battery." This is Battery I, 1st United States Artillery. "The soldiers who were sorry," and he goes on to say, "I can now recall the names of the splendid soldiers who were sergeants, something I cannot do for any other organization I served with in my 45 years. The esprit de corps was magnificent." He mentions a story where one of these artillery pieces of this battery on July 2nd was struck. The wheel could not be replaced. One of the sergeants went 12 miles to find a forge, repaired that wheel, and in the evening of July 2nd, brought that artillery piece ready for action for July 3rd back to this battery. And he mentions that in his writings. He says that Woodruff, wounded on July 3rd, Woodruff is actually shot in the stomach right at the close of the battle on July 3rd for Pickett's Charge. And Woodruff is then taken to a little schoolhouse in the rear line of the battle. That is connected to the Gettysburg Foundation because it's part of the George Spangler Farm, which was the 11th Union Army Corps Field Hospital. The Spanglers owned the property all around Powers Hill. They own what is now the Granite Schoolhouse, and the lane was put in probably about 1861 when the schoolhouse was opened. And my guess is that the Spanglers actually donated the land for the schoolhouse. It became a temporary field hospital. Winfield Scott Hancock was actually taken there, but it ended up being very close to the artillery overshots, which were east of Pickett's Charge. So any of these artillery overshots from the Confederate line going over the Union line landed back in this field hospital. So it had to be evacuated because it was so close to where the artillery fire was hitting it. But here is a picture of the school. This comes from the Adams County Historical Society. This is what the school looked like in the 1880s. It is no longer there. School is no longer there, but it would have been right off of where Granite Schoolhouse Lane is. And unfortunately for Woodruff, he will die of his wound the very next day on July 4th, 1863. And they actually have his pistol in the collections of West Point. Now, you know, I'm an artifact guy. I love artifacts. So this is on the West Point website. They actually own the revolver that Woodruff carried here in the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, his brother is back home in Michigan on the 15th of July. So it appears from at least the newspapers that the father came here, retrieved George Woodruff's body and got it back up to Michigan about the 22nd of July. And his brother may very well have helped in getting the body, which according to Tully McRae, was buried by his fellow officers at the Granite Schoolhouse. So George Woodruff's body is buried at the Granite Schoolhouse. It's retrieved by Woodruff's father, and his brother probably had something to do with it. And his brother was on a longer leave than 20 days. His leave got extended, and we can tell from the writings in his military service record that his brother William was actually at the funeral, which was pretty hastily assembled because nobody knew exactly when the body was going to get back to Marshall, Michigan. The newspapers say that Woodruff's friends assembled and the body was buried there in the local cemetery. And I actually went up to Oak Ridge Cemetery, and here is the plaque outside the cemetery to George Woodruff. This is his family plot, and his body now rests within it. And his brother, William, of course, dying at Petersburg, actually died on the way to the field hospital, the Armory Field Hospital, Washington, D.C., wounded on the 25th of June, dying on the 28th of June, buried in Arlington National Cemetery, not part of the family plot that is up in Marshall, Michigan. But Woodruff's father's there, his mother is there. He had another brother in the service, and here this family buries two sons from the Civil War. Father buries two of his sons, one dying at Gettysburg and one dying at Petersburg, both Michigan soldiers in the American Civil War. So this plaque is up there to George Woodruff today. Now, while Pickett's Charge is going on, of course, what is happening about 4 miles east of Gettysburg, an action we call East Cavalry Field? We're not going to talk about Custer today, only peripherally about it, but let's talk about some soldiers that are over there. So we've done 3 Michigan soldiers now. We've got 2 left, and we're going to do 2 that are out there at East Cavalry Field that have wonderful stories. One in the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment, and one in the 7th Michigan Cavalry, both under the brigade of George Armstrong Custer. So let's look at Edward Gifford Crosby of Company E of the 1st Michigan. I gave a whole profile on him for Sacred Trust. He may be the only person in this room that you've all heard at least some story about. Crosby has a great history. Here's a picture that somebody sent me of him as a Michigan cavalry trooper. So he is 21 years old here, ladies and gentlemen, in the Battle of Gettysburg as a member of Company E. Like most things that we don't know about Civil War soldiers, his pension record said he's born in one place, and his military service record said he's born in another. We ought to know where you're born and where you died, right? These ought to be basic things we ought to know about you. And in the Civil War, nothing can be that simple. We've got 2 locations for his birth. He attends Genesee College, that closes up and actually becomes Syracuse University, ladies and gentlemen, that's there. And he moves to Michigan before the war. He's probably in Michigan in 1856, 4 or 5 years before the American Civil War, what we know about him. And then he's enrolled in Company E of the 1st Michigan Cavalry in 1861. His occupation is listed as a broom maker. And when I give you his career, this man becomes a millionaire. And he starts from nothing. He was a broom maker at the time of the American Civil War. At one time, according to his military service record, he is a messenger for General Dan Sickles, on top of his work with the cavalry. Now, I went down, I wasn't quite sure, is this guy really at Gettysburg? I read some things because it's crucial to this story to prove that he is at Gettysburg. And his military service record, this is it. Present for May, June 1863, present for duty as a private in E Company of the 1st Michigan Cavalry out there on East Cavalry Field. Now we know while Woodruff and Henry Cummings of the Sumter Light Artillery are dueling with each other, while Woodruff is fighting against the left of what we know as Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble's charge, we know that Jeb Stuart has cavalry troopers east of Gettysburg to disrupt the Union line. Probably the number one question asked Jim Hessler, who's in the room, my co-author here with Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, is, was that a coordinated action? What evidence is there that Jeb Stuart came over and he was to attack the rear of the Federal line at the same time that Pickett and his men are attacking the front? There's simply no evidence that that was coordinated. Now we do know that that cavalry out there east of town is covering some roads, right? They're covering the Low Dutch Road, the Hanover Road, and of course that's the rear to the Baltimore Pike, which is the Union supply route. And Stuart has orders that he's over there to disrupt the rear of that line. So there's cavalry fighting out there. There are 2 cavalry charges at least. The 1st Michigan Cavalry, the 7th Michigan Cavalry. Custer leads both of them. And the 2 soldiers that we're talking about here, one in the 1st Michigan, that's Crosby, this man. Another we're going to talk about in the 7th would have been in those charges led by Custer himself on July 3rd, 1863. One of them becomes a pretty good friend of George Custer's. Here is a map from the American Battlefield Trust that shows both the 7th Michigan, ladies and gentlemen, and the fighting of the 1st Michigan Cavalry here. So Edward G. Crosby would have been part of this action for July 3rd, 1863. Now he's going to survive the Civil War. Here we know the Michigan Cavalry shaft's right out in the middle of the battlefield here today. And Crosby will survive the American Civil War. He will marry in 1868. He has 3 children. And according to the census record, he occupies a number of different jobs. Now, his marriage certificate says in 1868 he's a millwright. Now, remember, in 1861, he is a broom maker, right? Then he works in a sawmill, at least according to what we have, and he eventually raises money, moves to Lake Michigan, Muskegon, Michigan, actually is where he is. Here is where it is. And he will become a tug captain. By 1887 and 1888, he is listed as being a tug captain. He gets a government contract to build a pier at Muskegon, and he will establish a very lucrative ferry business across Lake Michigan that will take you from Muskegon over to Milwaukee. Now that is about 82.5 miles. There's a ferry service that does this today. So you put your car, you put your bicycle, you put yourself, and you take a ferry 82.5 miles across, and it's about a 2.5-hour ride. Now that sure beats trying to go around Lake Michigan, ladies and gentlemen, and going through all the traffic in Chicago. If you do this without traffic, it's about a 5-hour ride. So you're cutting your ride in half here, and this becomes a good moneymaker. In 1894, by 1894, Edward G. Crosby buys his half interest in his own boat, the SS Nyack. This is the vessel. I got this off a postcard, and he will establish not only this business, but he will make alliances with Charles Melville Hayes, who is the founder of the Grand Trunk Railroad that goes across Canada and has connections in the United States. So if you're running a ferry from Milwaukee over to Michigan, you can then get on the railroad train that'll take you in Canada. It'll take you right to New York City, and you can be there in just a couple days. Now, he has 3 children, as I mentioned. To you, Harriet Rebecca Crosby, which is his oldest surviving daughter. She's born in 1872, and she dies in 1941. She will marry a salesman from Flint, Michigan, and they will not have a very good marriage. So she will divorce him. She will go to France and England, where she will study music. She loved music, was a very accomplished musician, and she will fall in love with her music instructor there. She will become pregnant and have a baby in February of 1912. So Edward Crosby and his wife Catherine decide that they're going to go to Europe, retrieve the daughter and granddaughter, and they're going to do that in 1912. And they will book passage back to the United States on this ship. This is a true story. Did you know that there was a Michigan cavalry soldier at Gettysburg who was on the Titanic? And here he is. Now, for some reason, they leave the daughter. Well, they bring the daughter. They bring the daughter and his wife, but they will leave the granddaughter, who's born in February of 1912. They will leave that baby with a nanny in England. And so Crosby, his wife, and his grown daughter, adult daughter, are all on the Titanic. And they're first-class passengers on the Titanic. We know the rooms they were in on the Titanic. So when I found out that this guy's on the Titanic, I said, I want to go to Milwaukee. So I went to Milwaukee because he actually moved his residence from Muskegon, Michigan to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That's where he actually lived when he was on the Titanic. And I went to the Milwaukee Historical Society and I pulled the Grand Army of the Republic sketchbook. Now, the Grand Army, if you remember Grand Army of the Republic, you had sketchbooks where you wrote out your service record. What was your service record during the war? And believe it or not, the Milwaukee Historical Society has the original personal sketchbook of the GAR post that Edward Crosby was a member of. And when I opened it to the original page of Crosby, this is what it showed, which is the Titanic, and it says, died April 15, 1912, was lost on the steamer Titanic, age 70 years old. He's 21 years old here in the Battle of Gettysburg. His wife and daughter get on a lifeboat. We actually know the lifeboat that they were in because of the testimony on the Titanic. They survive. He goes down with the ship, and he is identified by materials in his pockets. Since he was a first-class passenger, his body was preserved, and the head of the Crosby Transportation Company, the manager of that company, went to Nova Scotia, identified Edward Crosby's body, and brought it to Milwaukee, Wisconsin for burial. Now, if you pull his pension file down in the National Archives, Washington, D.C., this Michigan soldier in the Battle of Gettysburg, what is in there but an original death certificate from Nova Scotia from the Titanic? This is actually in his service record right here, and or in his pension record. It says he was body number 269 from the Titanic, and it takes a while to get his body back, but in May, it comes back about 3 weeks after he dies on the Titanic. Notice it says SS Titanic, and here is a notice of his funeral where it says the city transportation offices, a lot of them were closed. They honored that, and it talks about Walsh who's the passenger agent, Crosby Line, went to Halifax to get his body that's there. Now, this body was originally buried in a mausoleum in Milwaukee. And that mausoleum was falling down, so in 1996, the city contracted to have every body that was buried inside that mausoleum taken out of the mausoleum, put in a cemetery, and today there is a fire station where the mausoleum actually stood. So the bodies were taken and buried in one of the local cemeteries there, Graceland Cemetery, and this is the actual grave of Edward Crosby, his wife Catherine, who died in 1920, and their daughter, who died in 1941. And there is a memorial stone to the family put up by the Titanic Historical Society, and it today is there in the cemetery. A Michigan cavalry trooper with Custer in that charge of the 1st Michigan at East Cavalry Field, dying on the Titanic on April 15, 1912. What a story, huh? Can't make this stuff up. It's so good. It's just so good. Now, recently, thanks to Jim, my co-author, we went in the fall around Labor Day to Appomattox. We got a special tour that Jim set up for myself and some of us went. And Patrick Schroeder, the historian at Appomattox, gave the tour at Appomattox, and I got an idea to include that story from this tour that I took in September of just this past year. And it covers Lieutenant George Briggs. Now, Briggs was in Company A of the 7th Michigan Cavalry, also out at East Cavalry Field, next to Edward Crosby, and he was the acting adjutant here in the Battle of Gettysburg. He's from Livonia, Wayne County, Michigan, and he lived in Grand Rapids for his entire life after the American Civil War. So, as part of this trip, we went into the Appomattox Courthouse Visitor Center there, and here were a great amount of stuff related to George Briggs. So let's talk a little bit about Briggs. Briggs' father was from Massachusetts. His mother was from Quaker stock here in the state of Pennsylvania. He's born in January of 1838. His family settled in Michigan in 1835. Now, Michigan becomes a state when? 1837. So these folks are very early settlers of Michigan, and he's actually born in the state of Michigan. He attends Olivet College. He left to accept a bookkeeper's position in Illinois, where he spent 5 years, and then he came back on the eve of the Civil War to settle in Battle Creek, Michigan. According to the records, he was in 56 engagements in the Civil War. 56 engagements in the Civil War. He was twice wounded in the war. He had 4 horses shot out from under him during the Civil War. And after the war, he will return to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he has a multitude of different positions. But when we went in on Labor Day weekend, our group into the visitor center at Appomattox, there was an entire case of artifacts on display from George Briggs. And that gave me the idea for this story. This is the case. Now, these artifacts, ladies and gentlemen, not quite all of them belong to Briggs. That sword belongs to Alexander Pennington, who commanded the artillery battery at East Cavalry Field. Pennington was a regular artillerist. All these other items belong to George Briggs in this case. And according to what I found, these were sold at auction by a family member who owned them from Rhode Island in 2013, and they garnered $184,000 in sale price. Now, I was just told by the historian at Appomattox that 2 weeks ago, this case and all the items were disassembled and the items went back to the owner. So this is no longer on public display. I'm not exactly sure how long it was here. So you can't go to Appomattox and see these right now, but luckily on our trip in September you could, and there's great history behind some of these artifacts. So let's Let's take a look at them. What's in there? This is an escutcheon that belonged to Briggs. These, you could order these after the Civil War. Companies produced them. It had all your ranks and all the engagements that you had during the Civil War. He started as a first lieutenant in 1861, adjutant here in the Battle of Gettysburg, and in May of 1865, right when the war ends, he's promoted to full colonel. And he's actually discharged out of service at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in 1865. Now, he plays not only a critical role here in the Battle of Gettysburg, where he is part of that charge that Custer will lead with the 7th Michigan Cavalry as adjutant. He would have been right up in the front row with the headquarters crew as part of that charge. But George Briggs has a fascinating history when it comes to the surrender of Appomattox. So he becomes very good friends with George Armstrong Custer. On April 9, 1865, the day Robert E. Lee surrenders to U.S. Grant, Briggs is the lieutenant colonel of the 7th Michigan Cavalry. And he is right near Custer at Appomattox when the surrender flag comes out. And this is a sketch. He is probably, this is Custer right here. He's probably one of these figures right here. We don't know exactly which figure he is, but this is Alfred Wadd, who was a very famous sketch artist from the time of the American Civil War. And the man carrying the white flag is going to be Robert M. Sims. Sims was a captain on General Longstreet's staff. He's the assistant adjutant general and inspector general, a graduate of the Citadel, and he is the one chosen to ride out into the Union lines to try to find Phil Sheridan on the morning of April 9 to tell them that Robert E. Lee has gone to go see U.S. Grant and they want to cease hostilities here for the morning of April 9, 1865. Now, what's interesting is Sims, in his haversack, has a white towel he bought in Richmond. He bought 3 of them for a price of $40 a piece. Now imagine this is Richmond in 1865. Talk about inflation, everybody. He pays $40 for this towel, and the only thing that Sims has that he can use as a surrender flag is a tea towel that he bought in Richmond for $40. And that towel is still around, ladies and gentlemen. This is it at the National Museum of American History, but it's actually, believe it or not, only half the towel, only half of it. Mrs. Custer took half of this towel, cut it up, and distributed it among people that she knew. And as part of the Briggs collection, she actually sends a letter in 1908 to George Briggs and sends him a few things that were part of this display that is now in a private collection but was on display at Appomattox. And here it is. And she says in the 1908 that she replaced the lower panel of the drawer from the table that General Lee surrendered on, and she took part of that wood and put it here to send to George Briggs. This red piece of fabric is from one of General Custer's famous red scarves. And this is the half of the towel that Mrs. Custer cut up and distributed the pieces. So there are 3 famous pieces here from the surrender on April 9, 1865 for Appomattox. And of course we know the chairs. Here's the chair Lee used, the table Lee used, the chair that Grant used. These are all in the National Museum of American History. And here is George Briggs later than life. He's got a terrific career. So not only is he involved in being next to Custer when Sims rides up with this white towel to be part of the surrender, but he later becomes the head of the Monument Commission to put all the monuments at Gettysburg. So George Briggs is from Michigan, from the state of Michigan. So the Michigan monuments at Gettysburg, he actually heads the commission, and he also headed the commission to put up the monument to George Custer in Monroe, and that monument was dedicated in 1910 George Briggs dies in 1912, and Briggs headed up the commission, helped select a sculpture for the statue that is in Monroe, Michigan today. He was to attend the Monroe festivities. He was to be there when that monument was dedicated in 1910, and according to the newspaper, he went from his office on a streetcar to go to his house, which was being built in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and as he was stepping off the car, he fell and injured himself, and he was unable to make the dedication of the Custer Memorial in 1910. I went to Oak Hill Cemetery in Grand Rapids to find his grave. Here it is. He is in the Pierce family plot, which is his wife's family plot. So if you didn't look closely on the back of this stone, you wouldn't even know he's in there looking around. But he dies in 1912. He held many political offices, including the postmastership of Grand Rapids, and a friend of George Armstrong Custer's, and someone that had a lot to do with the Michigan monuments here in the Battle of Gettysburg. So ladies and gentlemen, you've heard about 5 Michigan soldiers in the Battle of Gettysburg, and we put a Confederate in there just for you here. What a great story about Michigan and Gettysburg, including one man who's on the Titanic that's here. And of course, now you're going to get Wayne Motts' 50-cent commercial with the foundation. So the granddaughter came back to the United States, and she became a professional dancer, and she lives to be over 90 years, about 90 years of age. Oh yeah, and somebody asked, what numbers are they? I don't know the exact numbers, but there's a number of Canadians. If you look at the units that are up in New England or the ones here, number of Canadians fight in those units in the war. I had my aunt and my uncle residents of Michigan for more than 40 years. Of course, the biggest rival at my Ohio State University is Michigan.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Garry, Owen, and glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go to jail from Garry, Owen, and glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man for debt shall go to jail from Garry, Owen, and glory.
Cool.